So today we're talking about animal metabolism, nutrition, and digestion. And some animals are predators, such as these dragonfly nymphs. And so these are baby dragonfly. They live in the water, and they actually catch prey, such as small fish, that they feed upon to get energy. And I know that we like to eat food because it tastes good, but there's a main reason that we actually eat food. It is for metabolism. So we need to get energy to fuel our body, and that's why we eat. There are three main molecules that we use as energy sources: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. We break these down to produce ATP, which then we use to fuel different cellular mechanisms in our body. In order to break these down, there is a linked set of chemical reactions that have to happen. We have catabolic reactions, which break down food sources to fuel the energy needs of a cell. And then we have anabolic reactions, which result in net energy storage within the cells and the organism. Anabolic reactions are important because sometimes we eat more food than we actually need to spend at that particular moment. And so having that backup net energy storage allows us to use energy when we're not actually eating food. So what is our metabolic rate? Our metabolic rate is an animal's overall rate of energy use, and it could be affected by three things. It can be affected by activity level, body size, and body temperature. And we're going to talk about how each of these three affect metabolic rate, and we're going to start with activity level. The onset of activity requires immediate energy. And this is provided by specialized energy stores in our tissues. So when an animal shifts from rest to activity, its metabolic rate and oxygen consumption rise to meet its increased demand for ATP. So if we look at this figure, we can see here's a person at rest, and immediately when you shift from rest to some sort of activity, such as running, we have a sharp increase in the amount of oxygen that we need because we need that to help produce more ATP. We then can use glycolysis, which you learned about in Bio 150, as a very fast way to provide rapid short-term supply of energy. So this gives us energy for short bursts of intense activity. Although glycolysis produces relatively few ATP molecules per molecule of glucose breakdown, the trade-off is that this reaction is so fast, so it gives us rapid ATP. But we can only rely on this for short bursts of energy. When the exercise ends, oxygen consumption will gradually fall to resting levels. But it does not fall immediately. Your body has to make up for this oxygen debt by slowly decreasing the amount of oxygen that we need so that we can make up for the lost oxygen from our exercise. So how is metabolic rate affected by body size? At rest, larger animals consume more energy and have higher metabolic rates than smaller animals, which you can see on this figure below. On our x-axis, we have our mass in grams, so we go from something very small, such as a single-celled organism, to something very large, such as a chimpanzee. On our y-axis, we have our resting metabolic rate, and you can see that as we get larger, the metabolic rate gets bigger. So we have an increase in energy and metabolic rates as an animal gets larger. The resting metabolic rate does not increase linearly with an animal's mass. Measurements of resting metabolic rate in a wide range of organisms show that the metabolic rate increases with animal mass raised to 3/4 power. So what this means is that the average rate at which each gram of body tissue consumes energy is less in larger animals compared to smaller animals. So if we're comparing this fruit fly to the chimpanzee, in the chimpanzee, even though it's a larger animal and it requires more energy overall, each gram of body weight in the chimpanzee uses less energy than a gram of body weight for the fruit fly. So larger animals are more efficient at using energy to fuel their body. So how does body temperature affect metabolic rate? Temperature affects the rates of chemical reactions. Temperature determines how fast fuel molecules can be mobilized and broken down to supply energy for a cell. So there's two different strategies that have evolved in animals for them to deal with temperature. The first are ectotherms. Ectotherms are animals that obtain most of their heat from the environment. So they regulate their body temperature by behavior. So they move in and out of the sun, for example. So this lizard in this picture will bask out on a stone in the sun to get warm. When it then is warm enough, it can go into the shade to cool down. And so using these behaviors, it can change its body temperature. Most fish, amphibians, reptiles, and invertebrates are ectotherms. So they use behavior to modify their body temperature. The other strategy are in animals called endotherms. And endotherms are animals that produce most of their own heat as byproducts of metabolic reactions, which includes the breakdown of food. In endotherms, they maintain a constant body temperature that is typically higher than that of the environment. Mammals, including humans and birds, are all endotherms. Because endotherms are regulating their own body temperature, they have a higher metabolic rate than ectotherms. This allows them to be able to be active over a broader range of external temperatures. So you're more likely to find an endotherm in very extreme habitats, such as very cold places like in the Arctic, because they're able to keep their body temperature at the proper level to survive. So if we look at comparing endotherms and ectotherms, we can see on this graph that endotherms have a higher metabolic rate than ectotherms. So on our x-axis, we have our body mass, and on our y-axis, we have our metabolic rate. So that's calories per grams by hour. So we can see here that ectotherms, which is this lower line, require roughly 10% of the energy intake of endotherms of similar size. This is because ectotherms are not using energy to regulate their body temperature, so they require less food to fuel their body, where endotherms, such as humans, are constantly regulating their body temperature, and so they need to eat more food to be able to fuel this metabolic process. So now it's time for your first question for the day. True or false? An elephant has a higher total resting metabolic rate than a mouse. So pause the video and answer the first question below. So now that we know why it's important to eat, because we need to fuel our metabolic processes that use ATP, how do organisms eat? So we're going to talk about a few different feeding strategies. The first is suspension filter feeding. And in suspension filter feeding, water with food suspended in it is passed through a sieve-like structure. This is the most common form of food capture by all animals. But this type of food capture strategy is only possible in aquatic environments because you need to have food particles suspended in water. Many worms and bivalve mollusks, such as this scallop in this picture, clams and oysters, pump water over their gills to trap food particles suspended in the water. So you can see this filter feeding structure here that allows them to filter food particles as the water washes over their gills. Other aquatic organisms, such as baleen whales, which you can see here, move water with food particles suspended in it through filters in their oral cavity, so in their mouth, and then they move the food into their gut. So they take in large amounts of water into their mouth, and as that's happening, they have these structures here that help to capture food particles. The next type of feeding strategy is suction feeding, and that's a rapid expansion of the fish's mouth cavity that draws water in and the desired prey into its mouth. So this traps prey inside of its mouth. So if we look at this fish here, this fish is able to be a sit and wait predator, which means that it can hide in a coral reef or under rocks before rapidly striking to capture prey moving in front of them, and then they basically suck the prey into their mouth. Many insects, such as mosquitoes that bite to obtain a blood meal, or other insects that use a straw-like proboscis to get phloem and xylem out of plants, also rely on suction to draw their blood or plant fluids into their digestive system. So if we see in this mosquito, the mosquito has a needle-like mouth part that they use to pierce into their host, and then they suck blood up through their proboscis just like you would suck liquid up a straw. So that's another example of suction feeding. Active swimming feeding is practiced by larger fish and marine mammals, and these larger animals that have larger sizes are able to swim quickly and catch smaller or similar sized prey. So in this picture, this is a great white shark that is jumping out of the water to capture a seal. So it's actively swimming to catch its prey. Insects that do not use suction feeding have mandibles. Mandibles are paired mouth parts located outside and in front of the mouth and are used to capture and physically break down food before it enters the mouth and the gut. So these mandibles are found in arthropods, so insects and crustaceans. So if you want to compare what mandibles would be on a human, mandibles are like an insect's teeth, but they're on the outside of their body. They have evolved a great diversity of structure, and so they're well adapted for different sources of food. So you have this ant that's eating another insect, but you can have something like a wasp that's going to feed on pollen. And so there's a wide range of structures, as you can see from these few examples here, of how mandibles have evolved to help insects eat a variety of different types of food. Vertebrates do not have mandibles. Instead, we have jaws. And the evolution of jaws and teeth has enhanced our ability of vertebrates to capture greater amounts of food, which allows for a more active and energetically demanding lifestyle. So if we look on this phylogenetic tree, we can see that jaws have evolved here. There are jawless fish, which we will learn about in the next lecture, but most vertebrates have jaws. So we can see sharks have jaws, which makes sense if you've seen the movie Jaws, all the way up to mammals having jaws. And if we look specifically at mammals, mammals have evolved a specialized jaw joint, which is called a temporomandibular joint. And you can see it here in humans, in the cat, and in the cow. And this jaw has allowed us to be better at eating different types of food. So it has allowed for a great diversification of types of food that we eat. Heterotrophs are divided into 3 groups based on the food sources that they eat. Herbivores only eat plants. Carnivores eat other animals, and omnivores eat both plants and other animals. And if we look at these pictures of the human, the cat, and the cow, we can see that the teeth and jaw structure of these animals is different based on the type of food that's going to be eating. There are some similarities where all of these organisms have incisors, which are used for cutting food, canines, which are used for ripping and tearing food, premolars, which are used for shearing, and molars, which are used for grinding. But if you look at the differences, there's different numbers and sizes of these types of teeth depending on the type of food that is eaten. For example, in carnivores tend to have large canines, which are important to help them rip off flesh from other animals. Whereas herbivores have very small canines because it's typically easier to rip plant material into pieces. But herbivores have much larger molars and premolars because they need to grind up that plant matter before they can swallow it. Whereas carnivores have smaller and less molars and premolars because that's not as important for them when trying to break apart their food. So we have another question. So our second question for the day. Among the multiple types of teeth, blank are used predominantly for crushing and grinding. A, incisors. B, canines. C, molars and premolars. Or D, wisdom teeth. So pause the video and answer the second question below. All right, we have another question. Capybaras primarily consume grasses, aquatic plants, fruit, and tree bark. They also rely mostly on their metabolism to control their body temperature. Capybara would best be described as A, herbivorous ectotherm, B, herbivorous endotherm, C, carnivorous ectotherm, or D, carnivorous endotherm. So pause the video and answer the third question below. Now that we've talked about different feeding strategies and about jaws and teeth, we're going to switch gears and talk about digestive systems and how they actually work. So the purpose of the digestive system is to disassemble food molecules into monomers, so into small molecules that can actually be used in ATP production. There are 2 main types of general digestive systems. The first is a gastrovascular cavity, which you can see in this hydra here. In a gastrovascular cavity, digestive enzymes are released into a cavity that the food is taken into, and there's no other specialization in the digestive system. So food enters this cavity here, and then these cells secrete digestive enzymes. The food is digested, and then it leaves the cavity as waste, and that is all that happens in that digestive system. Most animals have a more complex digestive system, and they have what is called a true gut, which means that we have a separate mouth and a separate anus. The mouth is where we take in food, and the anus is where we excrete waste that we cannot digest. In a true gut, we have extracellular digestion, where food is isolated and broken down outside a cell in a body compartment. So in most animals, this starts in the mouth. Then it will go through the digestive system, always being in a compartment of the body instead of being digested directly by a cell. Because of that, we have specialized organs that help to do different jobs. And you can see, looking at this nematode, earthworm, and salamander, that different organisms have more and more complex digestive systems. Most animals have the same basic plan when it comes to the digestive system. Some animals, which we will talk about later in this lecture, have evolved more specialized structures, but the overall general plan is the same for all animals. There is a foregut, which is in green in all these animals, and that's the initial storage and digestion chamber. This includes the mouth, esophagus, and the stomach or crop. So after the foregut comes the midgut. This is where the remainder of digestion and most nutrient absorption takes place, and this includes the small intestine. And finally, we have the hindgut. In the hindgut, that is where water and inorganic molecules are absorbed. It leaves behind the waste product, or feces, which are stored in the rectum until they are eliminated from the body. So the hindgut includes the large intestine, rectum, and anus. If we look specifically at the vertebrate digestive system, there's some more complex parts to our system. So our digestive system is a tubular gastrointestinal tract with accessory digestive organs. The list here are our main organs that are needed for digestion to occur. The first is the mouth and the pharynx, and that's our initial food breakdown. So the reason that we chew our food is to begin that process of breaking it down before it is even swallowed and enters the rest of our digestive system. The sole purpose of the esophagus is to deliver food to the stomach. The stomach then uses mechanical and chemical digestion processes to break apart food even further. We then have the small intestine, which uses chemical digestion and absorption of nutrients. Then we go to the large intestine, where we reabsorb water that we have used in the process of digestion. And then finally, the food goes to our rectum or our cloaca, and that's where waste storage happens until it is eliminated out through the anus. So if we look at the stomach in particular, the stomach has enzymes that need to act at a very low pH, of a pH of 1 to 3. The cells lining the stomach secrete hydrochloric acid to maintain that low pH. So sometimes people say they have acid reflux. That's because some of that stomach acid is coming up your esophagus, and it's actually burning the lining of your esophagus because your esophagus does not have the cells that are able to withstand such a low pH. The stomach is one of the main sites of protein and lipid breakdown. In humans, it typically takes about 4 hours for the stomach to empty. Most carnivorous animals consume large and infrequent meals, which results in long periods of digestion and nutrient absorption compared to animals. So for example, snakes that engulf large prey whole elevate their metabolic rate to high levels during digestion and spend several days digesting and absorbing the nutrients from their meal. So they have a large meal, they take a long time to digest it, but they do not need to eat as often as we do. The way that we chemically digest food in the stomach is through having that high pH that allows those enzymes to chemically break down food. To mechanically break down food, our stomach has muscular contractions that move food down the digestive tract and help to actually break it into smaller pieces. And this muscular contraction happening in our digestive system is called peristalsis. Food leaving the stomach passes through the pyloric sphincter, which is a band of muscle at the base of the stomach. This opens and closes to regulate the rate at which the stomach empties. So after the food leaves the stomach, it enters the small intestine. The small intestine is the primary location of chemical digestion and absorption of nutrients. Protein and carbohydrate digestion continues in the small intestine, and fat digestion begins. If we look at this picture, we have in the lining of our small intestines many villi. And if we look here, you can see how many of these there are. And this provides tremendous surface area, which aids in transporting nutrients out of our small intestine and into other cells. The small intestine is associated with accessory digestive organs, and these include the liver, which produces bile, which helps to break down fats, the gallbladder, which stores and concentrates bile, and the pancreas, which makes pancreatic juice, which contains digestive enzymes. And bile aids in fat digestion by breaking large clusters of fats into smaller lipid droplets. So now we're going to watch a video about how glucose is absorbed by the small intestine.
How do nutrients, such as glucose, in the food that you eat end up in the bloodstream so that they can be broken down and used by the body? The process begins inside the small intestine, in the lumen. The epithelial cells lining the lumen of the small intestine have transmembrane receptors that bind glucose as well as sodium ions. The concentration of sodium ions is typically higher in the lumen of the small intestine than in the cytoplasm of the cell. So sodium ions move down their concentration gradient from the outside to the inside of the cell. The movement of sodium ions down their concentration gradient allows glucose to be co-transported into the cell. The concentration of sodium ions is kept low inside the cell by the action of the sodium-potassium pump. This transporter uses the energy of ATP to move sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions into the cell. Once glucose is inside the epithelial cell lining of the intestine, it is able to move passively through channel proteins located on the basal surface of the cell. From there, glucose passively enters the bloodstream, driven by its concentration gradient, and then travels to cells of the body that use it as a source of energy.
Okay, so as you saw in the video, glucose, and this also happens for other amino acids that are required by our body, are co-transported into cells lining the intestines with sodium ions from gut contents. Sodium ions bind to a transmembrane protein on the surface of cells lining the intestine that also bind the nutrient molecules such as glucose. Absorption of the nutrient molecule into the cell is driven by the movement of the sodium ion down its concentration gradient. Because the products of fat digestion, which are fatty acids and glycerol, are lipid soluble, they do not require a carrier protein for transport. Instead, they readily diffuse across the lipid plasma membrane, entering that cell of the small intestine where they can be further broken down and then transported to the locations that they're needed in the body. So after we have our nutrient absorption in our small intestine, what is left then moves to the large intestine. The large intestine is important for the reabsorption of water. Excess water absorption can cause constipation, because the waste that is being left is too dry to be released through the anal cavity, and too little water absorption results in diarrhea because the waste is too wet and is not able to be held in by the anal sphincter. Diarrhea and constipation also can be caused by toxins released by microorganisms, such as the bacterium Vibrio cholera, which causes cholera in animals from drinking usually contaminated water. In our large intestine, we have a large amount of symbiotic bacteria, and they help extract nutrients from the animals that the animal's body cannot extract itself. They provide nutrients in certain vitamins, such as biotin and vitamin K, which humans and other animals cannot make. The main bacteria in our gut is E. coli. There's different strains of E. coli, but the one in our gut we have a symbiotic relationship with, so we do not get sick. About 50% of the mass of feces is either living or dead bacteria. Herbivorous animals have evolved specialized digestive tracts. This enhances their ability to digest cellulose and other plant compounds. Most herbivores cannot digest cellulose on their own because they lack the enzyme cellulase, which is what is required to break down cellulose. So herbivores have specialized compartments in their digestive tract that contain large bacterial populations which can produce cellulase, and so they're able to digest the plant material. Ruminants, which are cattle, sheep, and goats, have a 4-chambered stomach, which is highly specialized to enhance the ability of their gut bacteria. In ruminants, they are called foregut fermenters because the first part that the food enters after they swallow is the rumen and the reticulum, which are the first 2 chambers in their 4-chambered stomach. The rumen and reticulum, which you can see here in the zoomed in picture of this cow's digestive system, harbors large populations of anaerobic bacteria that break down cellulose by fermentation, which then allows this broken down food particles to move into the small intestines, where then they can get the maximum amount of nutrients out of their food. Most other mammalian herbivores have what is called hindgut fermentation. Hindgut fermentation occurs in the colon and cecum, which is a large chamber that branches off of the large intestine. So if we look here in this rabbit, the food goes from the mouth to the esophagus, into the stomach, and through the small intestine, which is the area that we have most of the nutrient absorption happening. The food then goes into the cecum and then travels down the large intestine. Because the bacteria that can break down cellulose are found in the cecum in hindgut fermenters, this is a much less efficient way to get nutrients because the food has already passed through the small intestine where most of the nutrient absorption happens in animals. In order to deal with this less efficient way of breaking down cellulose, some animals, such as rabbits, hares, and pica, consume their own feces, which is called coprophagy. So rabbits produce 2 types of fecal pellets. They produce hard ones, so those are those hard black little balls, and they also produce soft ones called secotropes. They re-ingest, so they eat these soft secotropes to extract further nutrients because these secotropes can move through their digestive system again and enter their small intestine, so those nutrients that were not absorbed the first time can actually be absorbed. And the secotropes are derived from chewed plant material that collects in the cecum. So they're concentrating those nutrients that they did not get the first time the plant matter moved through their digestive tract so that they can get it on the second time through. Birds also have adaptations in their digestive systems. Birds have beaks and they do not have teeth because instead they have a beak structure. Because of that, they have evolved other ways to break down food. So birds utilize crops and gizzards. A crop is, if we see in this picture, we have a mouth, the bird swallows the food, it goes to the esophagus, and then goes to the crop. The crop is the location of food storage, and then it is later moved to the stomach through that muscle contraction in the digestive system, or what's called peristalsis. After the food moves through the stomach, it then enters the gizzard, and the gizzard helps with additional food breakdown. In many birds, they actually eat small stones that can facilitate the grinding of food. And here is a gizzard that has been cut open. It's a gizzard from a chicken, and you can see all these stones in the gizzard, which help to grind up food particles before it then travels to the small intestine for nutrient absorption. So a different way that birds have adapted to get the most nutrients out of their food. So now we're going to have another question. An animal's foregut includes the A, large intestine, B, small intestine, C, cecum, or D, esophagus. So pause the video and answer the fourth question below. We have another question, yay! Which part of the digestive tract is the predominant location for water and mineral absorption? Is it A, the foregut, B, the midgut, or C, the hindgut? Pause the video and answer the fifth question below. And our last question for the day. Horses are large herbivores that lack the four-chambered stomach of foregut fermenters such as cows. You would therefore expect the equine or horse gut to have an enlarged blank relative to omnivores of similar size. So you would expect it to have an A, enlarged cecum, B, enlarged pancreas, C, enlarged small intestine, or D, enlarged stomach. So pause the video and answer the last question below. I hope you learned a lot about animal digestive systems today. Remember to post any questions that you have in the discussion board, send me an email, or attend the Zoom office hours Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 3 p.m. And do not forget to submit your clicker question quiz below. And for our last picture for today, this is a whale shark, which is one of the largest organisms in the world. And you can see that it is feeding through suction feeding. Have a great day.